Welcome back. We're going to discuss the last part of topic 10, which is the Russian Revolution. We've already alluded to problems in Russia with the last video that the Russians pulled out early from World War One and had a separate treaty with Germany. But let's talk a little bit about what this revolution was and why it's significant. Okay. Uh, there's lots of causes for the revolution in Russia. Um, One of them is that a lot of Russians were just in abject poverty. Most of them were peasants. Very few Russians were prosperous. The Industrial Revolution, which brought in some better conditions for some people, and particularly enabled the middle class to be created. It also created a large group of people that became known as the proletariat. These were industrial workers, wage earners. They lived in cities, but the only thing they really had to offer was their labor. They really had nothing else. Uh, there was an opportunity back in 1905, and we talked about this earlier with Russia, that there was a revolution, and there was an attempt to try to create a representative government. This was called the Duma, but it turned out to be a very weak kind of rubber stamp thing for the czar. They created a secret police force to keep people's criticisms of the government to a very low level, and there was a lot of corruption in the Russian government. When World War One started, Russia was not prepared. Very often, soldiers were sent to the front without weapons and were told to retrieve weapons off of dead soldiers. And that's not a good situation. So by the second year of the war, 2 million Russians were dead going into this. And of course, the Tsar, Nicholas II, maybe he was a nice guy, but he was very incompetent. And he and his family were under the influence of a very interesting man in history called Gregory Rasputin. He was a monk, supposedly could help the czar's son deal with his hemophilia. If you are interested, he is a fascinating person to look into. But he was considered to be very disreputable, and it destroyed Tsar Nicholas's the confidence that people had in him, and it made them really not like his family. Uh, by 1915, you start to see workers' councils called Soviets being established throughout the country. You have basically a struggle between two types of socialists: the Bolsheviks, who are very radical, who are going to be later known as communist, and Mensheviks that are somewhat moderate, who want reforms to take place but not drastically change things. The leader of the Bolsheviks is a man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Sometimes he's just simply known as Lenin. Um, but he is the person that's leader of the Bolsheviks and later is going to become the first leader of the Soviet Union. Uh, Germany basically had Lenin living there. The Russians had exiled Lenin to Germany, and one of the things that the Germans decided to do was to send Lenin back to Russia to cause discontent. I would imagine that the Germans resented this, or regretted it rather, because Lenin creates a country that's going to give a lot of trouble to Germany. The Bolsheviks, what they wanted to do was to pull Russia completely out of the war. They were promising land, peace, land, and bread. Uh, the provisional government that was created when the Tsar resigned was headed by a guy named Kerensky. He refused to take Russia out of the war, and so that's basically what's going to push people over the edge. In November of 1917, the Red Guard, who were the Bolsheviks, and the Russian Navy, they basically brought down the provisional government. They took over the government, and so the Bolsheviks gained control over Russia, and they created a socialist state. People in Russia don't necessarily, not everyone wants this, and so there is a divide between the people who support the Bolsheviks and everyone else. The Bolsheviks were called the Reds because their flag was the red banner of revolution. The Whites, they represented everyone from czarist to Mensheviks to people that just wanted to see moderate reform. They were really kind of a hodgepodge of people. But one of the things the Bolsheviks did is they appealed to the Russian sense of nationalism, particularly since the whites were being supported by the Allies. You had foreign troops in Russia who were fighting and killing Russians. the Bolsheviks appealed to the desire to protect their motherland. And ultimately, the Bolsheviks are going to win. Both sides were pretty nasty with dealing with people. The whites killed people, the reds killed people. But some examples of what the Bolsheviks did is that they did execute the imperial family. They killed Tsar Nicholas and his whole family rather than them fall into the hands of the whites. They created a secret police force called the Cheka, which was very much like what the czars used to keep track of people. They created prison camps called gulags where they sent political dissidents in distant places like Siberia, and many of these people never returned. They also seized private property for the war effort. This was called war communism. So basically, they said everything's going to go for the war effort. You're going to grow stuff if you're a farmer and give it to the army or to people in the cities. There are no private businesses. Everything's run by the government. And then you have these people called commissars who were positioned in different places around the country to make sure that everyone in the different areas stayed loyal to the Bolshevik movement. By 1921, the whites had been defeated, and so the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was created. Sometimes, though, this is just known as the Soviet Union. So to just call this Russia in this time period is not really correct. They have a constitution. So in many ways, this looks like a democratic, representative government type setup. They had a legislature called the Supreme Soviet. They gave universal suffrage to men and women. Everyone 18 and over could vote. The people technically are the ones who control all political power, all resources, and all the means of production. So the people are supreme. And the different republics that were created, you had the Russian Republic, the Ukrainian Republic, the Kazakh Republic, the Belarus Republic. All these different republics that were created were basically equal. But the reality is that the Communist Party, which is what the Bolsheviks ultimately are called, they're the ones that are in control. They do not allow dissent. They do not allow people to have an alternative voice. They're the only parties that are on the ballots. And in reality, the Russian Republic dominated all the others. So on paper, a lot of freedoms are guaranteed, but the reality is that there wasn't a whole lot of freedom that was granted to the Russian people. Lenin, after the establishment of the Soviet Union, created a different approach to running the country economically. He abandoned war communism and implemented something called the NEP, the New Economic Policy. All the big industries were still owned by the government, by the quote unquote people. But he did allow for small private businesses and peasants to operate their own fields and to sell things for profit. And this actually did a lot to help Russia regain a lot of its economic health. Ultimately, he wanted everything to be under government control, but he said initially, Lenin said initially that he would allow a little bit of capitalism to work. Unfortunately, Lenin died about 2 years after the creation of the Soviet Union. He had two people that assisted him with his efforts. One was a man named Leon Trotsky. The other is named Joseph Stalin. These guys had two very, very different goals about what they wanted to see happen with global revolution, with Bolshevism, with communism. Trotsky wanted to take it on the road. He wanted to spread revolution globally, and he said that needs to be done now. Stalin said, we need to build up the Soviet Union first and then spread communist ideology around the world. Stalin wanted to be the leader of the Soviet Union. He basically had Trotsky put into a position where he was exiled, and later he had him murdered. And Stalin becomes the sole ruler of the Soviet Union. Very brutal dictator. And he is going to be the leader of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. He actually is our ally, the United States ally during the war. But he was just as brutal as Hitler in many ways, although he wasn't the same political philosophy as Hitler. So we'll deal more with that later. I want to show you some pictures of these people. On the far left in the upper left-hand corner, This is our Nicholas II. The middle picture on the top row is Rasputin. The last picture on the top row is Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin, as they say in Russian. This guy, and I love his hair. This is Leon Trotsky, and then this is Joseph Stalin. Uh, Sometimes he's called Uncle Joe by some people who aren't necessarily being respectful. So, but this gives you some imagery of what these people look like. This concludes the notes for topic 10. So definitely look back over these videos if you need to. Look over the PowerPoint notes. As always, you can either Zoom with me or email me if you have any questions or concerns. So thank you, and I will see you for topic 11.